The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Florida Historical Society Press publishes books on a variety of topics relating to our state's diverse history and culture. FHS Press titles include Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives, Hollow Victory, a novel of the Second Seminole War, Stetson Kennedy's Palmetto Country, and Walk in Lawton. More information at fhspress.org. The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. A bust of journalist Mabel Norris Reese was unveiled at Sunset Park in Mount Dora on September 24, 2021. More than 100 people gathered to celebrate Mabel Norris Reese, using words like courageous, heroic, and fearless to describe her fight against racial injustice. She wrote for the Mount Dora Topic newspaper and the Daytona Beach News Journal while facing threats and intimidation from the notoriously racist Lake County Sheriff Willis McCall and his enablers in the Ku Klux Klan. It's been said that journalism is the first rough draft of history. Many of the authors represented here at the Library of Florida History in Cocoa include newspaper accounts of current events as primary source material. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. Newspaper journalist Mabel Norris Reese was owner and editor of the Mount Dora Topic beginning in 1947.
They'd have these pool of reporters at the press conference, and she was the only woman. So she was in with the Sentinel, the Daily Commercial, the Leesburg, all these newspapers, but she's really the only woman. And not only that, but she actually runs her own newspaper. So she had a lot more freedom than some of these guys that she's working with. But I just found it really fascinating to see her trying to negotiate this man's world, this club, where these male journalists were kind of like protecting the status quo a little bit more. And Mabel had a little bit more autonomy, and she could actually write about what she wanted. So it's really an interesting dynamic to see something in the 40s and this woman who's running the newspaper and just be thrust into these major stories.
I remember her as actually being very nurturing. I lost my first tooth at her house and was petrified the tooth fairy wouldn't be able to find me. And so she made a phone call, which I assumed was to the tooth fairy, to tell the tooth fairy where I was. When I was in third grade, we had desegregation of the schools, and she had me write a letter to the editor about there's nothing wrong with us being desegregated, and I don't know what all the hoopla is about. So she definitely pushed me to be aware of what was going on and to be aware of racial tensions and to just stand up for what was right. And she'd push real hard for that. Even when she was being very nurturing, there were still the suggestions, you need to do this. And if the gentle push didn't work, she could get much more forceful because she felt so strongly.
Just a couple of years after Mabel Norris Reese began reporting on events in Central Florida, the infamous Groveland rape trial began.
The Groveland case started in Lake County in 1949. It was a young woman and her husband, who she was separated from at the time, went out on a date to try to get their marriage back together, and something happened alongside of the road. The next thing we know, she had made the claim that she had been abducted and sexually assaulted by 4 African Americans. This brought the Klan in, started burning down African American homes. It became a powder keg. A really big trial happened like a little bit more than a month later, involved Thurgood Marshall. So this became a very big civil rights case focused in Central Florida at the time.
In 1949, I don't think anyone is still certain what happened on this night with the Paget couples, Willie and Norma Paget, a young couple who had separated. They got back together to go to a square dance. And on the way home, something happened. They claimed that she had been attacked by 4 young black men and carried off and raped. They claimed they were nowhere around. Regardless, all hell broke loose in Groveland. There were several nights of rioting, Klansmen caravanning through Groveland, shooting up the black community. The entire black population of Groveland was evacuated to Orlando. A couple houses were burned down. Of the 4 Groveland suspects, 1 of them was shot and killed before trial. 3 of them went to trial and were convicted. Harry Moore got involved in it from the very beginning. As soon as they were arrested, he sent a young attorney to Rayford to interview the defendants and came back with a story saying they had just been beaten mercilessly. They'd been hung over a water pipe in the Lake County Jail, and Willis McCall's deputies beat them with rubber hoses. Those beatings were then documented by the FBI and by the NAACP National Office. So he was involved in it. He was calling it a travesty of justice from the very beginning.
Harry T. Moore contacted Mabel Norris Reese, asking her to write about how Sheriff McCall was mishandling the Groveland case.
4 young men from the Groveland, Florida area was accused of raping this young white woman. There was a trial held, defendants were convicted, but then there was evidence introduced that there was going to have a retrial, and supposedly the sheriff of Lake County, Willis McCall, was transporting 2 of the defendants from one jail to another. And along the way, something happened. The 2 defendants ended up being shot, 1 being killed. The sheriff's account of that was they tried to escape, although they were handcuffed and shackled, which kind of makes it hard to believe.
Mabel Norris Reese had initially supported Sheriff McCall in her articles, but it was the shooting of Walter Irvin and the killing of Sam Shepard while in McCall's custody that was a turning point for her.
She came down here, I think she wanted to buy into the community, reporting on a lot of community news, Little League scores, Northerners who were coming back down to Mount Dora. And I think she was friends with the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, and helped her get into the world of Sheriff Willis McCall. And I think she was a little bit naive and sort of thought that racially that this was an idyllic place when it clearly was not. And I think the turning point for her, because she covered the first trial, was the shooting of the Groveland boys in 1951 as they were waiting for the second trial. The prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, at that point said, I don't think that was an escape attempt. I think it was deliberate. Mabel had a lot of communications, and that was really her turning point. And I noticed if you look at her career, from that moment on, and it was like November 1951, she was all about justice. And justice didn't sell in a small town newspaper. That's not what people really wanted to hear about, white supremacy. And so you could see as she got her courage and as she found her sort of inspiration about the things to write about, the things that really interested her, she's also facing the backlash in her own community. And I thought that was a really powerful thing that she just continued to do it, knowing that it was going to hurt her pocketbook, as she said.
Harry T. Moore got involved in that case and went and tried to get statements of anybody that knew about it from the surviving witness themselves. And he called on the governor of Florida, wrote letters to the Justice Department calling for the suspension and the charging of murder of Sheriff Willis McCall. Now, some contend that because Willis McCall was such a powerful sheriff back then, and as you know, in the state of Florida, sheriffs generally have a lot of power there. They feel that he had some part in either the planning or the implementation of Harry Moore's ultimate death.
After the initial conviction, the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall appealed the death sentences of Walter Irvin and Sammy Shepard. Their convictions were overturned by the Supreme Court. A new trial was scheduled. The day of a hearing for the new trial, Willis McCall and his deputy went to Rayford to pick him up. On the way back to Lake County, claimed that the two prisoners jumped him and attacked him, and he shot him. He emptied his revolver into him. He killed Sam Shepard, mortally, seriously, critically wounded Walter Irvin, who did survive, and told a completely different story, which is that McCall just yanked him out and started shooting. At that point, Harry T. Moore started calling for McCall to be removed from office, indicted for murder. He's telegramming and writing letters to the governor, to the U.S. attorney, to Thurgood Marshall, to the FBI. And then just 6 weeks later, he was blown up in his house. So the morning after the bombing in Mims, people immediately connected the Groveland case to the Moore bombing. And when the FBI agents and the local deputies worked their way through the crowd that had gathered and said, why would anyone have wanted to kill Harry Moore? Everybody immediately said Groveland.
Mabel Norris Reese was not killed for her efforts on behalf of racial justice as Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore were. She did, however, face an ongoing campaign of intimidation as described in the books of Gilbert King and Ben Green.
She started writing about the support of the Brown versus Board decision, which was not a very popular decision in the South, but she was writing about saying we need to make this work, we need to be patient, this is the right thing to do. And that was when the trouble started. You know, the white supremacists started bombing her house, poisoned her dog. They defaced her office right up the street, just vandalized it, wrote KKK all over it. And the final turning point, which was just bizarre to me, is some white supremacists opened up a rival newspaper in Mount Dora, as if Mount Dora needed a second newspaper. And basically Willis McCall went around and just threatened all of Mabel's advertisers. And that was it. They had no choice. Willis McCall was the most powerful person in Lake County and basically just ran her out of town, ran her out of the county.
The dogs getting poisoned, one dying. My mother said she thought the big one died because it got the steak faster than the little one could get it. But just the things that happened to my mother that my mother used to wish that my grandmother would quit being such a force of nature. And my mom, when you think about a teenager and going through high school, she graduated in 1959 from Mount Dora High School. High school kids don't want their mothers doing what my grandmother was doing. So it caused tension in the house. My grandmother's marriage broke up. She lost the paper, but she still believed in what she was doing and wasn't about to back down. And I found a letter from the Daytona Beach News-Journal where she'd applied for a job over there. And she wasn't going to quit writing about what was going on, and she's lost her paper, but she's still going to go find another job in journalism and keep the fight and stay in the area. She could have moved anywhere and chose to stay in the area so she could keep the fights that she'd started.
Mabel Norris Reese continued to fight for racial justice from the relative safety of the Daytona Beach News-Journal.
She did, and I think that was one of the things. She was given this freedom because that was a progressive newspaper at the time. And so she was given the freedom to continue doing what she was doing, but now she had the support, of a bigger newspaper behind her. One of the things that she did, which was covered the St. Augustine, the summer of 1964, which I think a lot of Americans are not really as familiar with that. But Martin Luther King was down here. There was a standoff at the Monson Motor Lodge. Some really important things were happening in 1964 in St. Augustine, and Mabel was right in the middle of it, interviewing Martin Luther King and sort of working with the Klan, and it was amazing how she was able to report on this.
Long after the Groveland case, Sheriff McCall and his associates continued their pattern of civil rights abuses. Even in the face of threats and intimidation, Mabel Norris Reese continued working to bring McCall and his enablers to justice.
She continued to write about Willis McCall. She felt personally offended that Willis McCall was getting away with all of this stuff in Lake County. McCall liked to brag that he was investigated on civil rights crimes 49 times and he beat every one of them. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's true. He escaped untouched. And Mabel just felt that personally an affront. And so she continued to report on him, expose him. She was also doing things behind the scenes, like writing to the governor, saying this sheriff is an embarrassment to the state. He's going to do economic harm to the state. And she was finally able to find in Reuben Askew someone who really listened to her and had similar feelings about Sheriff Willis McCall, and that really spelled his downfall.
Growing up, we didn't think that was anything amazing. That I just assumed everybody's grandmother did the things that my grandmother did. And then as I got older, and then especially when Gil's books came out, because honestly, Gil has done more research on my grandmother about the things that happened before I was born. When I began looking at it as from a mother's perspective, an adult's perspective, I realized just how courageous, I know there was fear, how courageous it was for anybody to fight McCall and the Klan, but especially for a woman to do it.
Mabel Norris Reese used her power as a journalist to defend the rights of the Platt children to attend a whites-only public school, even though they were suspected of being Negroes. Her articles on the Platt family gained national attention. She also championed the cause of Jesse Daniels, a mentally challenged teenager who was framed for a crime he didn't commit and institutionalized for 14 years. Mabel was largely responsible for his release.
She really was. In fact, when they did the claims bill to exonerate Jesse Daniels later, they mentioned, I think the wording was something along the lines that were it not for the tenacity of a female newspaper person in Lake County, Jesse Daniels would have spent the rest of his life at Chattahoochee. So they really acknowledged her. She really continued this case. When she was run out of Lake County, she was still writing about it in Daytona. She became friends with Jesse Daniels' mother. And it was like this friendship and this camaraderie of trying to get this innocent kid out of Chattahoochee. And Mabel actually ended up getting Jesse Daniels a lawyer from out of town that was really effective, took it right to the Supreme Court. But everybody acknowledged that Mabel was the one that saved this kid's life.
When I was 12 or 13, I remember going over to my grandmother's house, and it was like it's going to be a big night. There's all kinds of exciting things going on, and I didn't know what was going on. And then it didn't happen, and it turned out it was Jesse Daniels getting out of Chattahoochee and coming home. Well, the day that they thought it was going to happen, it didn't. So it took a few more days. I remember my grandmother being devastated. And finally, Jesse got out, and the first place he and his mom came were to my grandmother's house. And I know Dick Graham was there too. And it was this big celebration. And I was young enough that I'd been sheltered from a lot of what was going on, but then things, especially with Jesse being there, I was asking questions and asking what was going on.
Mabel introduced her granddaughter to many prominent political figures and engaged her in discussions about important issues surrounding civil rights and social justice.
The older I got, every Sunday we had dinner at her house, and we would get into some extremely lively conversations at the table. When I was in 8th grade, she took me to Washington, D.C., just her and I, introduced me to Shirley Chisholm, Tip O'Neill, Fishbait Miller, who was introducing people in the House, taking care of things in the House of Representatives. Carl Albert, she introduced me to Carl Albert. Lawton Chiles. To me, it was, yeah, okay, these are cool people. And now as an adult, I'm like, oh my God, how did my grandmother have access to these people?
Mabel Norris Reese Chesley remained politically engaged until the end of her life on January 1st, 1995.
She was always on top of politics and what was going on. Even when she got older, after she'd retired, when C-SPAN came out on cable, my grandmother was the happiest person. She always had that on, would always talk politics. She lost her sight to macular degeneration, but still was on top of everything that was going on. And you couldn't go to her house without having a discussion about what was going on in the world, ever.
Fort Lauderdale-based artist Jim McNalis was a senior artist and art director for Walt Disney World, has designed large-scale sculptures for the Mardi Gras parade in New Orleans, and enjoys making political caricatures. He's also known for creating sculptures of courageous people like Mabel Norris Reese.
It just really is a joy for me to work on bringing a light, shining a light, literally resurrecting somebody like Mabel. We should know about her. You know, the role models people have, entertainment, sports, nothing wrong with that. But boy, let's not forget these people who are willing to put their life on the line, say no more, you know, keep the darkness at bay. So there's a harmony to this that was just wonderful. And we're all beneficiaries of it. It isn't just a project. Our lives are enhanced by being involved with somebody like Mabel.
Sometimes I think back to like Brian Stevenson from Equal Justice Initiative, and he talks about the monuments and what they mean. And growing up in the South, if you're African American, you might be walking down and seeing like these memorials to Confederate generals and soldiers. And these were all done in the early 1900s. And there are other people to celebrate in the South besides the Confederate generals. How about the abolitionists, the people who stood up to power, the journalists, the civil rights activists? There's so many other people to honor for the fight that brought America to where we are now. We don't have any Sheriff Willis McCall statues around Lake County. So as people begin to digest more information and understand the past, it's only right to celebrate the people who really made a difference. And I think it's really important as Mabel, as a journalist, to be considered a hero. Given the times for journalists, you know, enemy of the people, that kind of thing, fake news. She was gaslighted in Lake County for decades. And it's just so nice to see her get her due and her recognition.
An interesting element of the Mabel Norris Reese sculpture is a brooch incorporating the margin release key from Mabel's typewriter, which has her initials M.R.
Getting a hold of Cindy, I said, do you have something of Mabel's I can incorporate in there? And she shows up with the margin release key from the very typewriter she went after these guys on. And it's like, man, there are some projects, they get rolling, and I don't know, they kind of do themselves. Things show up that you couldn't possibly design into it. So it's nice to have a flexibility where all this stuff is available and you can incorporate it.
Cindy Erickson believes her grandmother would hope that the sculpture inspires new journalists and leads others to seek out good sources of reliable journalism.
So many newspapers nowadays have paywalls, and it's so hard for people to find neutral reporting because some of the crazier outlandish theories, there's no paywall and everyone can get to them. People aren't getting print newspapers anymore. And newspapers are losing, you know, their support and their funding. I honestly pay for 4 or 5 subscriptions to newspapers just because I don't want to lose the fair reporting, and I'll do everything I can to support that. And so I think having a journalist that fought for the right to report the truth, memorialized like she is an incredibly important thing. And if people stop and read that plaque and think about that, hopefully someone else will go get a subscription to a fair newspaper and learn and pay attention to the stuff that's going on and make their own decisions.
A lot of progress has been made to address the types of civil rights violations and social justice issues that Mabel Norris Reese wrote about, but there is still a long way to go.
It would be nice if we had come to that point where events of that nature were really just a memory, that they were part of history and whatever. It is not. And we have to recognize the reality of the time, that there's still a lot of work to be done.
Mabel Norris Reese earned 30 National Newspaper Awards, including the first Courage in Journalism Award in 1956. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Florida Historical Society Press publishes books on a variety of topics relating to our state's diverse history and culture. FHS Press titles include Life and Death at Windover, Excavations of a 7,000-Year-Old Pond Cemetery, The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives, Hollow Victory, a novel of the Second Seminole War, Stetson Kennedy's Palmetto Country, and Walk in Lawton. More information at fhspress.org. The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.